It's a quiet afternoon in the hills of California, the sun casting a warm glow over Doris Day's former home. The house, nestled in the serene landscape, seems to hold onto the echoes of its past. Every now and then, the sound of footsteps walking softly on the wooden floors can be heard, though no one is there. It's as if Doris herself is still walking through the halls, humming a familiar tune as she moves from room to room. The air is thick with the scent of flowers, roses, lilacs, and the jasmine she adored floating through the open windows. It feels as though her love for nature has seeped into the very essence of the house, lingering like a soft memory. She was known for her deep connection to animals and nature, and in this house, it's easy to imagine her sitting by the window, gazing out over the hills, her heart full of peace and contentment. On the garden path, there's a slight rustle, almost imperceptible, as if a breeze is carrying with it the laughter of days gone by. Doris's spirit is not one to be caught in the past. She was always forward-thinking. After all, but in moments like these, the house feels as if it has captured a piece of her timeless grace, offering visitors a glimpse of the star she was. It's in these little things, the quiet footsteps, the fragrance of her favorite flowers, that her presence seems to linger, a gentle reminder that she once graced this home with her love and joy. Perhaps, in another time, someone will pass through and feel it too. The faint, but undeniable, imprint of a legend who truly lived in harmony with the world around her. As the evening light fades and the house is bathed in a soft, golden glow, a strange, almost unexplainable chill sweeps through the rooms. It's not the kind of cold that comes with a draft, but rather a subtle shift, as though the house itself is adjusting, settling deeper into the past. In the living room, a well-worn piano stands against the wall, its keys polished by years of music and laughter. Occasionally, a single note rings out, clear and haunting, as if played by invisible fingers. The house seems to breathe with the rhythm of its former owner, each note a whispered invitation to uncover something hidden. The flowers in the garden, once vibrant with color, seem to grow in the most unusual patterns, arranging themselves as if they too are part of a secret story that only a few can read. Some say that at night, when the moonlight casts long shadows on the lawn, the flowers almost seem to shimmer, their petals glowing with an ethereal light, as though they are guiding someone or something toward an unknown destination. Neighbors often speak in hushed tones about strange occurrences at the house. A shadow passing by the window when no one is inside. The faint scent of lavender that drifts down the street on the wind, even when the flowers haven't bloomed for months. And then, there's the story of the old caretaker, a man who once worked for Doris, who claimed to have seen a figure standing by the garden gate late one evening. The figure, he swore, was her Doris, standing perfectly still, her white dress glowing like moonlight, her expression peaceful yet distant. When he called out to her, she simply turned, as though acknowledging his presence, before vanishing into the shadows. For those who know the house well, it has always seemed to possess a peculiar energy, as if it is not just a place, but a living, breathing entity, woven with memories of laughter and sorrow, joy and longing. Some believe that Doris, in her quiet, graceful way, left something behind in these walls, a part of herself, not easily seen but always felt. Those who spend long enough here say they sometimes hear her voice, soft and sweet, singing a tune that tugs at their hearts in ways they can't explain. The house holds its secrets close, and every so often, it seems to give a hint, a fleeting moment, a soft whisper, a sudden gust of wind. But the more you try to grasp them, the more elusive they become, slipping through your fingers like water. On some nights, when the moon is full and casts its silvery light over the hills, the house seems to take on an entirely different character. The air is thick with anticipation, as if something is about to unfold. Some of the neighbors, long familiar with the oddities surrounding the house, say they've heard music, soft, enchanting melodies coming from within, though no one is there. They swear it's not just the wind, but a song so clear, so beautiful, it could only be played by someone who once understood the deepest chords of the heart. And yet, when they venture closer to the house, the music stops, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. The garden, too, behaves strangely at times. The trees, which should sway gently in the breeze, seem to stand still, unmoving, as if they are listening, waiting. The flowers, always so alive with color, have been known to shift in the night, their petals slowly turning toward the windows, as though they're drawn by an invisible force. Some say it's the lingering energy of Doris herself, still tending to the things she loved. Others, however, believe something far darker has taken root here, something that only grows stronger with time. One stormy evening, as the wind howled outside and the rain battered the windows, a curious thing happened. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown of soft cream, was seen walking along the garden path, moving gracefully as though she was still very much alive. Her face was serene, yet there was a strange sadness in her eyes, as though she were lost in some faraway place, beyond the reach of time. She moved with purpose, but no one could quite explain why she never seemed to get any closer to the house. As though, no matter how many steps she took, she would always remain at the same distance, forever walking in a loop, circling the property. The following morning, the house seemed unchanged. But when one of the caretakers walked through the garden, they discovered something unsettling: footprints in the damp earth, perfectly preserved in the morning fog. The footprints, they later noticed, weren't the same as anyone's in the house. They weren't even human. Yet, they led toward the back gate, where the path suddenly disappeared into the wild, unkempt woods that bordered the estate. No one had entered or left the house the night before. Yet, something or someone had walked the garden. As the days passed, the mystery deepened. Some claimed to have caught glimpses of shadows moving in the windows, just as they had when Doris lived there, but these shadows seemed different. They didn't match the normal silhouette of a person. There was something unnatural about them, a disjointed movement, as though they were struggling to hold on to their own shape. The local historian, an old woman with deep knowledge of the area's secrets, warned those who came near to be careful. She spoke of the house's past, of the land it sat on, and of the strange energies that sometimes take root in places where too much has been left behind, too many dreams, too many broken pieces. The historian hinted at an old tale, one so ancient that it was only whispered about in the shadows of the town, but never spoken aloud. Some say it was the house itself that had called to Doris in the first place, something that reached out to her across time, urging her to make it her home. A house that, in its solitude, had absorbed the echoes of countless souls, each leaving behind a piece of themselves. Others believe the house is merely a vessel, a portal between worlds, and that Doris, too, had become part of its strange, eternal cycle. Late one evening, a letter was found written in Doris's own hand, though it had never been sent. It was addressed to no one in particular, and the words, when read aloud, sent a chill down the spine. The letter spoke of a whisper in the dark, and of a call from beyond, urging her to meet them on the garden path at midnight. The last line of the letter simply read, "I am ready to listen." No one knows what happened that night. No one knows who or what she was responding to. But ever since, the house has remained as it was, unchanged, waiting. And the people who dare to step onto its grounds feel it, the pull of something ancient, something hungry. It watches, it waits, and it calls. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. As the months passed, strange occurrences at Doris's house only seemed to intensify. The neighbors, once curious, now spoke of it with a mix of wariness and fascination, as though it had become a place of quiet terror, a place where the living and the dead intertwined in a way that couldn't be explained, no matter how much one tried to understand. The old caretaker, now retired and living just down the road, could never quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the house. He had worked there for years, but it wasn't until after Doris had gone that he began to feel its oppressive presence, like an unseen weight pressing down on the air. He spoke of moments when the house seemed to breathe, and of cold spots that appeared in the strangest places, often accompanied by the sound of footsteps, soft, yet deliberate, following him through the dark hallways, but never quite coming into view. One night, driven by an inexplicable urge, the caretaker ventured back to the house, his heart racing as he approached the front gate. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. It was a perfect night for ghosts, and he felt it in his bones. When he reached the door, the unmistakable sound of a piano playing echoed from within. But it wasn't just any song. It was the same haunting melody that had once filled the house, the one Doris had often played late at night. But this time it was different, dissonant, almost mournful. He stood frozen, listening, unable to move, as the piano keys seemed to play themselves in a slow, tortured rhythm. He finally found the courage to enter, pushing open the door, the familiar scent of jasmine greeting him. Inside, the house was dark and still too still. There was no music now, only silence. But as he stepped into the living room, he saw something that stopped him cold. The piano was open, its keys gently moving up and down, as if being played by unseen hands. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't look away. The air grew thicker with each passing second, heavy with something ancient and powerful. Then, as if pulled by some invisible force, he moved toward the grand staircase. Halfway up, he paused, his breath catching in his throat as a shadow. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was tall, indistinct, but the shape was unmistakable. It was Doris. But this figure was different. The woman who stood before him wasn't the vibrant Doris he had known. This one was pale, almost translucent, her face marked with a sadness that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of this world. Those eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, the caretaker felt as though his very soul was being pulled toward her. It wasn't just the look of recognition. It was something deeper, something more primal, as if she was reaching out, trying to tell him something. But before he could take another step, a cold gust of wind blew through the house, slamming the door shut with such force that the house seemed to shake. The figure of Doris vanished, and in her place stood something else, something darker. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth, as though the very foundation of the house had begun to shift. The caretaker stumbled backward, his heart racing, but as he turned to flee, the floor beneath him creaked. From the corner of his eye, he saw something, two eyes, glowing faintly in the shadows. They watched him, unblinking, waiting. In that instant, he understood Doris had never truly left. She had become part of the house, part of whatever ancient force lay dormant within its walls. But she wasn't alone. There were others here, others who had never found peace, trapped in a place where time and reality blurred. As the caretaker made his way toward the door, he glanced back one last time. The staircase was now empty, but the shadows lingered, swirling at the edges of the room, as though alive. There was no music, no whisper of footsteps, only the silence. Yet, as he stepped out into the night, he could feel it, a presence, just behind him, watching. And he knew without a doubt that Doris was no longer the only one waiting for something. But what? And who else was still here, hidden in the dark corners of the house? The caretaker never returned to the house after that night. He moved far away, never speaking of what had happened to anyone. But some of the locals began to notice strange things. People who wandered too close to the property sometimes spoke of seeing figures in the windows, faint, distorted images of people who weren't there, moving in and out of sight. Some even claimed they heard whispers on the wind, strange voices that seemed to call their names in the dead of night, luring them toward the house. And those who had dared to spend the night within the walls of Doris's home, well, they didn't return either. Some said they'd left, but when others ventured in search of them, they found nothing, only empty rooms, untouched furniture, and a strange chill in the air. Whatever lingered in the house had become something far more than just a memory. It was a place where time folded in on itself, where past and present collided in ways that no one could comprehend. And for anyone brave or foolish enough to enter, there was only one truth left to discover. Not everything that walked through the door of Doris's house ever truly left. The legend of Doris's house continued to grow, its mysteries becoming more tangled with each passing year. Word spread, as such stories often do, reaching the ears of those both curious and daring. But no one truly understood what had happened within those walls, not until a young woman, an investigator of the paranormal named Lila, decided to take on the house herself. Lila had heard the whispers, read the stories, and felt the pull of something inexplicable. She had spent her life studying the unseen, the forces that lingered beyond the reach of the living. But this place, it was different. Something about Doris's house called to her, as though she were meant to uncover the truth hidden deep within its haunted corners. She wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, not entirely. But there was something about the history of this house, its strange, persistent pull on the living, that intrigued her more than any theory or superstition. She arrived one cold evening, determined to unravel the enigma. The house stood before her, as it always had, with its graceful lines and elegant decay. It seemed to watch her approach, its dark windows reflecting the moonlight like black eyes. Lila wasn't afraid, not yet. She had been to haunted places before, places where the air felt thick with fear, places where voices whispered in the dark. But this house was different, felt alive. She spent the first few hours walking through the rooms, documenting everything, every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light, every chill that seemed to hang in the air. She noticed the same patterns others had before, the way the flowers in the garden bent toward the windows, the faint sounds of a piano playing in the distance. But there was something else now, something new. As she walked through the hallway, her flashlight flickered for a moment, and she thought she saw something out of the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the house, heavy and waiting. Her breath caught in her throat when she heard it, a soft sound, like a whisper, but no words. She couldn't tell if it came from the walls or from somewhere far deeper. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched, but more intense, as if the house itself was alive and aware of her presence. She moved toward the staircase, her pulse quickening. Something tugged at her, urging her to go up, to explore the second floor. She had read the accounts of those who had ventured upstairs. Many never returned, and those who did were changed in ways they couldn't explain. But Lila wasn't like them. She was prepared. She had studied the histories, the stories, the patterns. She had trained for this. The second floor was darker than the first, the shadows thick and pressing in. As she stepped onto the landing, she felt a shift in the air, something cold and ancient. She glanced at the rooms, their doors slightly ajar, revealing nothing but emptiness. But one door at the far end of the hallway was different. It was closed tightly, as though it had been sealed shut for a reason. Her curiosity gnawed at her, pulling her toward it, and she couldn't resist. The moment her hand touched the door, a sharp, piercing sound rang out, a single, high-pitched note from the piano downstairs. It was louder now, like a warning. She froze, heart pounding, but there was no turning back. With one swift motion, she pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else, something darker. In the center of the room stood a full-length mirror, its surface cloudy with age, but it still reflected the light in an unsettling way. There was no furniture in the room, only the mirror and a small, ornate chest beside it, the kind you might see in a place of forgotten treasures. Lila moved closer to the mirror, her breath fogging the glass. She couldn't help herself, she had to look. But as she did, her reflection seemed off, slightly warped, as if it were struggling to stay in place. And then she saw it, her own eyes, but they weren't hers. The figure in the mirror grinned at her, but the expression wasn't kind. It was something else, something old, something not quite human. It was watching her, waiting for her to notice. She jerked back, her heart hammering in her chest. The mirror's surface rippled for a moment, as if disturbed by her movement. A chill ran through her spine, and she could feel it, an overwhelming pressure, a presence behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there. But then, she heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deep in the house. It was not just the sound of the floorboards creaking. No, this was different. These footsteps were too purposeful, too alive. Lila's eyes darted toward the chest, and without thinking, she rushed to it, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the lock. It clicked open, revealing a stack of old papers, some yellowed with age, others so fragile they might crumble at a touch. The topmost paper caught her attention. It was a letter, written in a flowing, elegant script. She could feel the weight of it, the gravity of its words, as though it held a truth she was never meant to uncover. The letter spoke of a pact, of an ancient agreement made long ago, one that tied the house and all those within it to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. It spoke of a spirit that had been bound to the land, an entity that fed on memories and souls. The letter was signed by someone whose name Lila didn't recognize, but the signature was unmistakable. It was Doris's. The room seemed to close in on her as the footsteps grew louder, more urgent. She turned, but before she could reach the door, the mirror began to glow, faint at first, but then brighter, pulsing with an unnatural light. The reflection of the room in the mirror was no longer the same. It was wrong. It was distorted, like a dark, twisted version of reality, a place where the laws of time and space no longer applied. And in that distorted world, she saw them, the figures. Faces, eyes, and shapes from the past. Some she recognized, others she didn't. They were trapped there, behind the glass, reaching out, their hands pressed against the surface. One of them was smiling. It was Doris. But her smile wasn't the one Lila had seen in old photographs. This smile was different, twisted, cruel. And as she stared into the mirror, it seemed to smile at her, as if it knew she was the next to join them. Lila backed away, her legs trembling, but as she turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The house was no longer still. It was alive, and it was waiting. Lila's heart raced as she pounded against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The mirror continued to pulse with an otherworldly glow, and the figures inside pressed closer, their faces now distorted in agony. The footsteps, once distant, were now all around her, closing in like a tightening noose. Desperate, Lila turned back to the chest. Her fingers scrambled through the papers, searching for anything that could explain how to escape. That's when she found it. A single torn page, a desperate warning. It spoke of a ritual, one that could break the pact, but it required the soul of the one who had entered the house willingly. Without thinking, Lila snatched the page, her eyes widening as she read the final instructions. But as she looked up, the figures in the mirror reached out, their fingers brushing the surface. A cold, suffocating pressure filled the room, and the mirror cracked. In the instant the crack spread, Lila knew it was too late. The house had claimed her, as it had claimed all who came before her. The last thing she saw was Doris, her smile wider now, as she stepped out of the mirror and into the room, waiting to welcome Lila into the shadows. And the house, once again, fell silent, its secrets safe, its hunger momentarily sated. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.